Lena. Is there no hope for you? For whatever reason, she has this knack for repeatedly putting her foot in her mouth and then having to pick up the pieces and clean up her mess after the fact. Saying things that made no sense, that managed to alienate and piss off people, sometimes across the political spectrum, and then have to apologize afterwards. Most recently, she picked a very, very risky issue on which to make that kind of mistake. The whole issue of sexual assault. Now, for those of you who don't know, just a few days ago, last week, one of the writers and producers of the show, Girls, was actually accused of rape by an actress by the name of Aurora Perrineau. She alleges that this writer and producer, Murray Miller, raped her at a party when she was 17 years old back in 2012. She claims that she went to Murray's house with a few other people and states, and I quote, "At some point, I woke up in Murray's bed naked. He was on top of me having sexual intercourse with me. At no time did I consent to any sexual contact with Murray." According to Vulture.com, in response to these allegations, Jenny Connor and Lena Dunham issued a joint statement defending their former co-worker and saying, "Insider knowledge of Murray's situation makes us confident that sadly, this accusation is one of the 3% of assault cases that are misreported every year." Now, I'm sure y'all can already imagine for yourselves what kind of reaction that statement elicited. Predictably, a number of people on social media immediately leapt to condemn Lena Dunham and Jenny Connor for this statement, which they felt unfairly took the side of the accused over the accuser, and at the worst possible time, given the current climate with the Harvey Weinstein case, all these other cases that we hear about in the news. We keep hearing new cases coming forward almost on a daily basis. Since I last spoke to you guys, actually since even before then, we've heard about George Takei, more allegations against Al Franken, Roy Moore, a number of allegations against New York Times reporter Glenn Thrush. I mean, the hits just keep on coming. And it seems every time you look around, another one bites the dust. So it was entirely predictable that in this climate, a statement like this, especially coming from a self-proclaimed feminist like Lena Dunham, would have raised a lot of dander. But you know, it didn't have to be this way, as objectionable as it was, or objectionable at all. Here is the specific way, the specific place in which Lena went wrong. If you consult the exact text of her statement, I think it is very important to judge these things based on what's actually said specifically, not based on what others are saying the person said. The statement wasn't all bad, at least not in my opinion. One sentence I actually think is unfortunately true. I'm referring to the sentence where Lena stated, "But during every time of change, there are also incidences of the culture in its enthusiasm and zeal, taking down the wrong targets." As a matter of fact, that's true. This is something on which I've commented several times on my channel in the past. There are some cases in which accusations of sexual assault or rape turn out to be unfounded. Every now and then, there's even a case in which the accusation turns out to have been fabricated completely. I do think it's critical when we talk about those cases to emphasize that they represent a minority of all sexual assault reports out there. Exactly how small that minority is open to conjecture. Now, one statistic that's kicked around a lot, particularly by sexual assault activists and their sympathizers, is that only somewhere between 2 and 8%, or at most 10%, of sexual assault and rape accusations turn out to be fabrications. Lena Dunham threw out a 3% statistic. I've seen the methodology behind those statistics questioned already, and I think some of the questions raised about that methodology are legitimate. We have heard statistics that only a small minority of actual sexual assaults and rapes are actually reported to the authorities. Partly for that reason, it's hard to know exactly how many rapes and sexual assaults occur in society every year, for example. And how many of those, what proportion or percentage of those, are true and false. Given the nature of the crime, I have no doubt that most women could never bring themselves to make up this sort of thing. But every now and then it does happen. You have your cases like the Duke Lacrosse hoax back in 2006, where Crystal Mangum, the exotic dancer, actually made up out of whole cloth an accusation against 3 members of Duke University's lacrosse team. You had a lot of injustices in that case, prosecutorial misconduct. The DA in that case, Mike Nifong, was ultimately disbarred, which means he had his license to practice law yanked from him, and deservedly so. She herself later ended up going to prison for murdering her ex-boyfriend. More recently, almost exactly 3 years ago, you had that ill-fated Rolling Stone expose, which unfortunately turned out to be unsupported by evidence. Even now, I won't go so far as to say definitively that it did not happen, but the police conducted a thorough investigation and found no credible evidence to support it, etc., etc. So every now and then that sort of thing does happen. Personally, I suspect that the number of outright fabrications is relatively small. If anything, there are probably a lot more cases that fall into a gray area where the woman sincerely believes in good faith that what was done to her or what happened to her constitutes sexual assault, but the evidence and the objective facts make the picture more complicated. Whether it's that both parties involved were intoxicated, whether it's that the woman involved can't remember clearly everything that happened, etc., etc., etc. So Lena Dunham had a point when she said that sometimes the culture takes down the wrong targets. That does sometimes happen. Unfortunately, Lena's statement managed to go wrong in the very next sentence. She wrote, "We believe, having worked closely with him for more than half a decade, that this is the case with Murray Miller." Now this seems like an example of people reflexively siding with a person accused of sexual assault, sexual harassment, or rape simply because they know him personally. I can understand why someone in Lena's position might be reluctant to confront the possibility that someone with whom she's worked closely and someone whom she claims to know pretty well, someone who she says she's worked with for more than half a decade, could not possibly do such a thing. Unfortunately, that's just not the case. The landscape is littered with examples of situations in which a person presented a very morally upright and unimpeachable face to all of their acquaintances, or at least most of them, while still doing unspeakable dirt behind the scenes. They are typically good at what they do, which means being good at compartmentalizing their lives. They're good at hiding the dirt that they do from the people whom they sort of need to continue to believe in them in order for them to get away with these crimes. Frankly, I doubt that there's any sexual predator out there who has sexually assaulted or otherwise shown his dark side to every single woman he's met. Which means there are going to be at least some women who know him pretty well and probably haven't seen that side of him at all and therefore believe that he's not capable of doing such a thing. People in that position need to recognize, simply because you know this person and your interactions with him suggest that he's not capable of doing such a thing, that doesn't prove that he's actually incapable of doing it. So I think the first place Lena Dunham went wrong was in drawing any kind of conclusions about this case, one way or the other, based to any degree on her acquaintance with the accused. Of course, Lena being Lena, she managed to go wrong yet again in the very next sentence. She wrote, "While our first instinct is to listen to every woman's story, our insider knowledge of Murray's situation makes us confident that sadly, this accusation is one of the 3% of assault cases that are misreported every year." Lena, your first instinct should not be to listen to every woman's story. Your consistent practice should be to listen to every woman's story. If you had written, "Our first instinct is to believe every woman's story," that would have been a more defensible statement. Why? Because listening to a woman's story is not the exact same thing as believing it. I think we should all be able to agree that at the very least, we should listen to women who have this story to tell. Knowing that the statistical likelihood is that she's telling the truth, and knowing that this is one of the most horrific crimes that a person can suffer, particularly a woman, at the bare minimum, we should listen to what they have to say. Now, what exactly does Lena mean here? I don't know if this was just a poor choice of words or what, but how are you going to say that your first instinct is to listen to the accuser's story as if you thought better of it later on and decided not to listen? At a minimum, whether the accusation turns out to be true or false, you should always listen. There's no justification for not listening. You can't evaluate whether the accusation has merit or doesn't without listening to it. So it shouldn't be merely your first instinct to listen to every woman's story. It should be your practice in every single situation, regardless of what conclusion you ultimately draw about the veracity of the accusation. Now, how did Lena react to the inevitable firestorm of controversy and condemnation that ensued? She put out this apology on Twitter. This apology statement manages to exemplify once again Lena Dunham's penchant for saying things that are wrong, of a kind that'll alienate people on both sides of any given controversy. First of all, she says, "I now understand that it was absolutely the wrong time to come forward with such a statement, and I am so sorry." The wrong time? Lena, there never would have been a good time to make that particular statement. it was inherently and fundamentally flawed. You could have waited 6 months, you could have waited a year, you could have waited until after the guy hypothetically ends up being convicted and jailed or subjected to whatever punishment the legal system had to offer. Unfortunately, rapes tend to be underpunished even when they do lead to convictions, which they usually don't. It doesn't matter what the timing was. There was no good time to make this statement. Another area where the apology statement went wrong was here. Lena was correct to say, every woman who comes forward deserves to be heard, fully and completely, and our relationship to the accused should not be part of the calculation anyone makes when examining her case. I'm glad to see that this finally dawned on Lena. Lena went on to write, every person and every feminist should be required to hear her. Again, I agree that the morally right thing to do is at least to hear the accuser out. Yet Lena goes on to say, under patriarchy, I believe you is essential. Until we are all believed, none of us will be believed. Well, look, I do think that each accuser should be able to have some kind of contact with someone, particularly someone at an institutional level, if that's an option, who will, at the very least, strike a sympathetic and believing posture so that she feels comfortable coming forward. Again, the general statistical likelihood is that she's telling the truth. The case can't be adjudicated on that basis because general tendencies don't tell you anything about what the evidence in a specific case proves or doesn't prove. And ultimately, each case has to be judged on its own merits. So it doesn't make sense for either the justice system or college campus rape tribunals in that context, or even the court of public opinion, to draw conclusions about guilt or innocence based simply on the general tendencies. But those general tendencies are a good enough reason for us to hear out women in this position. Let me just say, I disagree with the second sentence that I just quoted. Until we are all believed, none of us will be believed. That, I don't think, is factually accurate, and it shouldn't be factually accurate. Most women are telling the truth, but to say that all women who state that they've been sexually assaulted or raped have to be believed in order for any women to be believed, I don't buy that. There are some cases, definitely a minority, in which false accusations are made. And then there are other cases in which the situation is just murky, the evidence is murky, and it's hard to tell who's telling the truth and who's not. I remember when the Rolling Stone UVA story first broke, one particular journalist, an acquaintance of mine, was one of several journalists and commentators who expressed skepticism about the veracity of the claims. He was promptly dragged for it online, along with the other skeptics. But guess who was vindicated in the end? And that story began to fall apart very early on. So I think it all depends on what the evidence in each case indicates. To the extent that we in the general public are going to take a position on specific cases, we need to base our conclusions on as many facts as we have available at any given time. And that's going to be difficult, and it's going to be more difficult in some cases than in others. Remember, justice isn't only about punishing the guilty, it's also about not punishing the innocent. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. One more case of foot-and-mouth syndrome from our friend Lena Dunham. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this isn't the first time Lena has chowed down on her own foot. Why does she so often get herself into these predicaments? I think she's often just thoughtless. She often fails or neglects to think before she speaks, to think the issue through, or to think the facts through, or to think through the available evidence before she pops off at the mouth. It's repeatedly gotten her into trouble. So that's my advice to you, Lena. The next time you're tempted to put out a statement, especially on such a charged issue as this one, you got to be more careful commenting on it than this. And if you're going to say that you're skeptical of it, you're going to express that skepticism in public, you better have better reasons for it than this. So please, heed my words, Lena. Word to the wise.